Okay, I think everybody is in, also from the metaverse of Zoom. So it's already some minutes past 12:30, so we are ready to start. And apologies for the little delay due to some technical issues that we had right before we let everybody in. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third in-person conversation for the future of Europe of this year of 2022. After the improvised only in-person special session last week that we had with Philip. So for those of you who connect for the first time, my name is Lorenzo Cicchi and I am the EGPP coordinator. Now, among the activities that EGPP does, we also organize a weekly seminar that takes different forms. We have book presentations, research seminars, seminars of the EU Studies Working Group together with the PhD researchers, seminars of the Europe in the World series that we organize thanks also to the help of Stephanie Hoffman, and like today, the conversation for the future of Europe that are sort of a special type of EGPP seminars. They are organized every spring and they are guided by Philippe Van Parijs, who's sitting next to me, with my humble organizational contribution. So today's conversation is titled Beyond the Conference on the Future of the EU, a Permanent Deliberative Assembly, without a question mark. It's a statement, no? And the speaker is Kalypso Nicolaïdis, a professor at STG, who is one of the leading scholars on democratic innovations and on democratic theory at large. And also someone who has been involved personally, firsthand, I would say, boots on the ground with the Conference on the Future of Europe, the COFE. And she was also involved in the Citizens Assembly that took place here in Florence at the EUI. And actually the proposal that she will talk about stems out from the deliberation of the citizen. So it's a proposal of the citizen of the European demo through Kalypso Nicolaïdis. Now, I would like also to thank everybody who's here and thank Daniele Caramani and excuse the audience on his behalf because he cannot be here. He's the EGPP director. And as for today's conversation, I will leave first the floor to Philip, who will reinstate the spirit of the conversation, say a few words about this special type of seminars that we have, and then present the speaker. I will then take the floor back and present the two discussants. And then in the best of my capacity, I'll try to chair the rest of the conversation. So thanks again for everyone who's here. And Philip, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. Pleasure to coordinate these conversations together with Lorenzo. As you know, so the aim of this conversation is to subject to a critical discussion some bold proposals. And no one or hardly anyone could be as good an introducer for such a session as Kalypso. And so won't use the usual cliche that she doesn't need an introduction. She does need an introduction in this particular context. I think Kalypso is one of those really bold and dynamic personalities who is very active, both as a respected scholar and as a really European public intellectual. We first met, as she might remember, as members of the doctoral commission of our common friend Justine Lacroix at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. And I first read something by her when I read the manuscript of the book she co-edited with Justine Lacroix under the title European Stories. This book was for me just a fantastic eye-opener. I mean, sort of extremely enlightening, sobering in some respect, and unforgettable for me because it gave a picture of the debate about Europe in a number of countries, not only member states, in a number of countries, that was so different from the picture we could have of what was happening in those countries on the basis of the people we meet in the Brussels bubble or in conferences of European studies. For example, among other things, I was struck by the description of the debate in Romania, which for me was quite amazing, and especially the contrast between these various things. Anyway, that was this book, which I keep recommending, was my first encounter with Kalypso's writings. Then subsequently I met her many times, including through the seminar which we jointly ran in Oxford between 2011 and 2015 on democracy and justice beyond the nation state. It was very stimulating, but didn't prevent the Brexit. We made, we tried, no, we tried, but well. And so it's a particular pleasure then to find her again here now that she's moved to the institute here in Florence to strengthen the continental university system, which needs it, especially after Brexit. And she, I mean, inserting her presentation by her within this series of conversations was an obvious priority for us because of her own boldness, and also because she's been following closely and partly through the democracy forum, the EUI Democracy Forum, what has been happening in this unprecedented event, which was the conference on the future of Europe. And so we are very curious to hear then in particular how our proposal has been refined, perhaps modified in the light of all she's been learning in the course of the last few months. So thank you very much to her. And before she speaks, Lorenzo will present our two commentators.
Thanks, Philip. So as the two co-discussants, we have today Veronica Angel, who is part-time assistant professor and Max Weber fellow here at the EUI. She's adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. She also received a double PhD from the University of Bucharest in co-direction with the University of Bordeaux on a theme which is actually quite far from today's seminar, namely coalition government formation in Romania, if I'm not wrong. She has also experience outside academia in more policy-making setting, as she also worked as a foreign affairs advisor for the Romanian presidential administration in the Romanian Senate. And she also received the 2020 Rising Star Award of the ECPR. I wanted to mention this. And apart from her interest in EU integration and party systems, especially in Eastern European countries, she is interested in democratization in more general terms. And I believe she observed from close a part of the Citizens Assembly that was taking place here at the EUI in the framework of COFE, which makes her indeed an excellent discussant for today's bold proposal vehicled by Kalypso. The second discussant is Christoph Nissen, also a Max Weber fellow. Christoph holds a PhD in political and social sciences from the Universities of Leuven and Namur in Belgium. His research deals with multi-level governance and deliberative citizen participation, and in particular, with a specific focus on how deliberative democratic innovations are received and are perceived by traditional decision-making actors. Now, I read this from your Max Weber page at the UI. During his Max Weber Fellowship, Christoph will examine the motives of decision makers around the world that institutionalize deliberative citizen participation. So I would say that this exercise as a discussant for Kalypso's proposal is really, I would say it's literally part of your engagement here. So I'm very happy to have you here. And again, this is not really Kalypso's proposal, but rather the DEMOI, the European DEMOI's proposal coming through her. Now, as for the housekeeping role, Kalypso will first speak for around 20 minutes. She will use slides. And then if you agree in this order, first Veronica and then Christoph will be discussant for 10 minutes each. And then we'll take the floor again and Philip will intervene as a sort of a discussion Sherpa by selecting and pointing out some specific points that Kalypso should reply straight away. And then we'll open the floor for discussion, both in the room and online. And as very last comment, I wanted to highlight how nice it is to be again back in a room with more than 10 people. I counted 16 people today, and you know, in comparison to the last 2 years that we passed, this really looks like a super crowded and a very lively environment. So thanks a lot for the in-person participation. So thank you again, and Kalypso, the floor is yours.
Maybe I'll stand, actually. It might be easier. Should I do that? up, stand.
Yeah.
Aerobics. So thanks, Lorenzo. And we've had the pleasure of working together very intensely for our Horizon proposal with Daniele and Ulrike here in the room, which actually is a way that we hope will explore these issues in the next few years, because this is a long-term agenda. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Veronica and Christoph's comments. I appreciate their work immensely. So this is a conversation indeed. Philip, thank you so much for your kind words. And you know how much I would, needless to say, I've appreciated our intellectual friendship. So these conversations for me are so precious. I don't think I've missed a single one in the last 2 years. So I'm very excited today. And I'm excited because, as Lorenzo said, you know, many of us in the room, including Andrea, my student here, and other students who were around, you know, were indeed participants in this exciting moment last December in Badia and here in this very room. Here it was education, I think, in this very room, you know, of this Citizens Assembly. And as Lorenzo said, by the end of this 2-3 intense days, in which was their last meeting of the Citizens Assembly on Democracy, they came up with all these recommendations. And the very last one, does anyone know the number of that proposal in the room? This is the first quiz. It was number 42. Which you all remember in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is the answer to the question of life, the universe, and everything. There we go. Do I need to say any more and use my 20 minutes? That's what the Citizens Assembly was. They actually voted to make themselves permanent, not themselves as individual, but everything they'd just gone through. So it must have been good. That this should be forever in the EU. That was their proposal. 42 became 39 later. Let's not get into numbers. So today what I want to do, because we are after all scholars and we can jump up and down with excitement, but we want to kind of give some sort of foundational back to that, is 3 parts. Why? What's the rationale for Citizens Assembly? And here I have to kind of, you know, say it up front. I speak as a kind of enthusiastic scholarly amateur. There are people in the world who have worked on Citizens Assembly for like ever, decades. There are people who are facilitators, like our friends at IFOC, Mission Publique, and all of those who were involved in here in Florence, who have done it. Many of them are also political scientists, so they're practitioners and analysts. I'm just kind of observing and loving it and trying to draw lessons. So I have to kind of, you know, forward my humility here. So the second thing, so we're going to do the why, the what happened at COFE, and what are the lessons very, very quickly. And then the how, where do we go from here? Indeed, the Permanent Citizens Assembly. But I think the why is very important to start with, because, you know, democracy is about citizens imagining themselves as the authors of their destiny. And what better than the Citizens Assembly? So the role of imagination in our thinking about democracy. And of course, there are many, many themes that I have listed here, which I won't have time to go through. The democratic crisis, the question of trust in our democracy, opening the club, the role of expertise, what does representation mean? How do you scale up? Because of course, this story about Citizens Assembly is a story that has happened around the world for these 2 or 3 decades, and of course for 2000 years too. There's huge, but usually it's local, sometimes national. But we haven't had transnational Citizens Assembly. That's what's at stake here today. So let me just give you this first slide, which is in part inspired by the work of my friend Yves Saint-Omer. And that simply is a slide to convey the story of Citizens Assembly. The idea that, well, it all started with the ancients, where sortition, which is of course the basic concept of Citizens Assembly, random lots, chosen by chance. Chance is a very interesting word, by the way. Well, this sortition was really based on a basic concept that most citizens in the city should be one day governed and one day governing. And they should know, even when they're governed, that they could be governing. It's sortition as rotation. Now, how do we get to sortition now, which is different? The sortition of the modern is sortition as representation. And there's this really big intervening factor, this big white arrow that I give you, which is the new story. that, well, in the 18th century, it's all about consent. It's all about how do you democracy at scale? You consent, but at the same time, everybody should consent kind of equally. Really? Not really. But something else happens, statistics, the idea of sampling and probability, the idea that you could get a representative sample. The ancients didn't have that, right? So you put this arrow and you intervene, and that's where you get sortition as representation. You can literally and scientifically not put your hand in a big jar and draw some balls, but do this because it's at scale. So we couldn't have millions and millions put their hands in, right? So this is how we get to sortition as representation. Now, even his work and others, of course, have kind of identified two logics of representation, and indeed two kind of waves, where we've had, you know, to some extent, a top-down wave, which was, hey, let's consult mini publics, citizens' jury. Fishkin was very active in that, but in deliberative polling. So that's deliberation. That will help us in our democracies. But the more revolutionary, or let's call it radical democracy, and we don't have time to talk more about this label, radical democracy, is really kind of when it becomes more a mode of mobilization. Who takes the initiative? And so we have participatory budgeting, the Occupy movement. Some of us call it epistemic democracy. How do you bring everybody together to mobilize to change things? These are two logics, which if we had time, we would say they interact and they're not so separate. But let's keep in mind these two deliberative and mobilization logic. So that's the rationale for Citizens Assembly. And backed by the idea, and there are many gaps in this story, I'm just gonna skip that, but now here is, I will give you four, there's much pushback out there. And I just give you four, but I could list them forever. And they're really important. You know, one is the traditional Platonic pushback. You know, these people are a multitude. They need guardians. It's, yeah, sure, it's great. It's about responsiveness, but what about responsibility? It's about input legitimacy, but in this complex world, we need output legitimacy. And basically, we need experts in it. So, yeah, great, but this is not how we can run complex democratic world. Then there is the kind of more cynical, or more the Peter Meyer, who was, of course, here, fig leaves. I mean, the worry that, hey, have political parties, not fun parties. This is the whole risk of hollowing out. This is a pretext for politicians, you know, they've consulted their citizens. And so all the intermediary bodies, poof, out the window, we've asked citizens. Third, algorithm. We had a wonderful in our EUI democracy forum, you know, one of my Greek friends, deputy, said, hey, who are these citizens? They're just chosen by algorithm. I have been chosen by citizens, the real ones with, you know, flesh and blood. So people just don't buy it. You know, you have to internalize a different understanding, a meaning of representation. And we discussed it a lot with Lorenzo and Daniele. To represent is to be present again in the democratic world. To represent for a citizens' assembly is that, yes, each individual may be chosen by lot, meaning that he could and she could be anyone. But the assembly as a whole is much more representative. It turns traditional representative democracy on its head, where every parliamentarian thinks, well, I've been chosen, but the assembly as a whole is elitist, not representative, and all the rest of it, right? But we need to talk about this story of representation, because in this whole pushback, very important, it's a clash of legitimacy. And it's, you know, we could come back to Annelien de Gene's wonderful book on liberal versus Republican freedom, all of these things, Q&A. And then the fourth pushback is about power. Hey, those in powers will always get their way. It's linked to the fig leaf, but much more stronger. There will always be manipulation by those who hold the reign of power and strategic endorsement. So we can come back to the pushback, but here I try to summarize it very simply. by saying, here is representative democracy. That's the reigning paradigm. And the conversation we want to have together is what is the composition of these arrows? And indeed, one of the worries or the concern by my friends like Karsten Berg and others who are very involved in ECI, in referenda, or Francis Schoeneval, or many of us who worry about the importance of direct democracy, is that what we see is that to some extent, deliberative democracy, citizens' assembly, can be a way of countering the call for direct democracy. We've consulted citizens, a sample of them. Why referenda? That could break everything. So we need to think about this triangle very strategically. So, last very quick point, because anyone who knows me knows that it's my obsession. I've written a lot about it. The beauty of citizens' assembly, or for some, the curse, is that it's actually helps us manage our political ambivalence, because citizens can come polarized, they're in their tribe, they're in their corner, they come to a citizens' assembly, they talk. Oh, this person is kind of like me, and they can assume it, they can live their ambivalence. We could come back to this, but for me, it's a very important issue. Is it good? Is it bad? For me, it's good. Now, very quickly, the second part, and now I've talked about citizens' assembly in general, but what about the transnational dimension? So if we had time in the transnational dimension, I would tell you much more about what I think should be an EU democratic, whatever it takes in general, but then that's our democratic resilience. The various sources of EU legitimacy, democracy after the others, but I don't have time. The question of systems competition, how we can use that in the global geopolitics of democracy. The question of ambivalence, the question of the COVID paradox, where citizens took their future in their hands. There's a whole story to tell about how COVID and citizen assembly could be linked. And the democratic ledger, the idea that in COVID, we lost, what can we gain? The fact that we have in democracy what I call antinomies of autonomy, but I'm going to skip that, to say that what we also need to do, and perhaps in the Q&A, is to come back to my triangle, but ask, how are the tensions magnified or mitigated when you become transnational? And that's the story I want to turn to very, very quickly, that representative democracy in the transnational is bound to lengthen the chain of delegation that is the basis for our democracies, and therefore the frustrations of citizens that power is far. So deliberative democracy has an even greater role to play transnationally because of this pitfall. And because in Europe, yes, we have a constitutional settlement more or less stable, but the socioeconomic and political foundations of Europe are shaky. We know that. And in part because we have all the formal structures, mostly. What we don't have is the praxis and the ethos of democracy in Europe today. That's what we don't have. And that in turn raises the question of how do we connect citizens in Europe who jump up and down, protest, do all sorts of things, but how do you really connect them with the institutions, right? That's what's at stake. And of course, no one who knows me would be surprised that I would connect all of this to my understanding of the EU as a democracy, because if you're a democracy, the aggregation between different peoples across countries, but also cities, regions, etc., is a very complex horizontal game. You can't just do the vertical thing of aggregating, like, hey, elect Joe Biden or Donald Trump. We can't do that in Europe. We don't have minorities that will accept the legitimacy of an EU-wide majority. And so if we do, we have the dilemma of a democracy, we need to find all sorts of innovative ways to connect people across borders so that they can govern together, but not as one, and that they can see themselves doing that in Citizens Assembly. Skip the theory. We could, get into greater detail about how democratic innovation can connect to all the EU institutions, or indeed to all the theories that have been told about European democracy. But again, skipping the crisis and all of that, basically the bottom line is that the more the EU does upward, the what, and we are going to see more of that with defense, with health, etc., the more it needs to be anchored in the people from below, the how. Contrary to the mainstream discourse that says, well, the more the EU has competence, the more the European Parliament should have competence. Sure, EP too, but that's not enough. So what we are at now is to respond to this transnational democracy challenge. We have the design for principles of deep democracy. And of course, Citizens Assembly are part of a broader puzzle. I will come back to this at the end. Which leads me to the lessons from the Conference on the Future of Europe. Beyond all the talk that we have to listen to citizens, that's what the conference was all about. And here I have a graph, which I see is kind of too small, which I had done with Laura Galland, about what were our expectations at the beginning of the COFE in terms of how it should integrate the Citizens Assembly. And we have this great, and that was based on the Citizens Take Over Europe principles that were about transnationality, participation, deliberation, etc. But let me be more, we could come back to this because I think it would be cool to, observe how well our demands were met, our expectations rather. But what I want to say, and that it all be visible and attractive and all of that. But let me just go more into the specifics here. So let me go through 6 points about the lessons from COFE. One is that is a whole conversation about the selection and the representation of the citizens. And Kantar, we talked a lot of, they selected the citizens. We're doing our best. Well, our best was okay, but not enough. Come back in the overrepresentation of educated, but also because people could say no when they got the phone call, as usual, you got overrepresentation of Euro enthusiasts and underrepresentation of Eurosceptics, which is a problem, as well as, of course, the problem of marginalized group. Martin, the group who works closely with me, has written a lot about this. Our students at STG were very, very concerned with the question of marginalized groups. But yet one good thing is, of course, that the youth, Generation Z, was 1/3 of the assemblies, all 4 assemblies, which was great. And they were much better at using languages, English, but also the internet to communicate. And indeed, that leads me to the second issue. This thing had a huge scope, a huge frame, very little time. That was a huge problem. All these topics bundled together. It was a lot about landscaping. The poor citizens had one weekend to kind of come up with all the sub-themes. Instead of what you should really do in a citizen assembly, ask hard questions, dilemmas. Should we send money on this or on that? Should this person be there? No. Who has power? No big dilemmas. So we had this problem of time versus scope. And the big thing, we'll come back to it, the multilingual challenge. Let's leave it for Q&A. Third, the role of expert. Many of us have thought about this issue here and watched, of course, when they were here in Badia. How were we selected? I mean, hey, we think, oh, we are the chosen. Yeah, any of us should do. But how do you select? What mandate were we given? In fact, it wasn't that clear, but the most important mandate was be neutral. Now, tell me, Philip, how is an academic neutral when we've spent 30 years thinking how the world could be better, could transform itself? Well, okay, we can have that conversation. What's the difference between knowledge and data or information? Should we intervene upstream? Let's train you guys as if you were our students, or downstream, we're just responding to your questions, but then where are your questions coming from? And should there be oversight? There wasn't, but that's one of the proposal. And then the second part, process deliberation. How did the process happen? The fact that there was translation meant that they didn't hear each other's voice. But there was interesting debates on multimodality. It happened on-site, online, and hybrid. And our students at STG did some really wonderful podcasts. You can go to our website, EUI Youth Democracy Forum, and I can give you, in fact, analyzing some of these differences. And how do they work together? The end game was very interesting. How do you aggregate all these citizens? They were sent to each other's subgroup. How do you get to a compromise? At the end, we had a voting system, and proposals were eliminated if they didn't get 2/3 of the voice, which was really weird because some really great proposals were not there. Citizens didn't really understand how that worked and all of that. But finally, the question that then we want to get to is what next? What next? Well, what next is what's been happening in the last 3 months. this plenary, where all the ambassadors, 20 for each 200, met with our meeting, with the politicians, the MEP, the MPs, the government reps, the EU institutions, etc. And what you saw there in a nutshell is really a clash of representation cultures and the need for reinvention. Because in short, you had these citizens in the European Parliament that had to learn the white card, that saw politicians read little scripts when they wanted to discuss, that so that no one was in the hemicycle when they were speaking, not understanding that all the work, or getting to understand all the work is done in the corridor. Where is power? Where is decision? Understanding that, what did some of the politicians do? Cherry pick. They picked what they wanted anyway, before even the citizens ever talked together, like the transnational list. Don't get me wrong, I like transnational lists, but it's complicated. That was just one little sub proposal. Some politicians, that's all they zoomed on. So, and then the question is that citizens ask is, do we matter? Where do we see our proposals? Have they been changed? Are they all in? So all of these debates, which were absolutely fascinating. And I have to say that watching how it went, what I'm really struck with is that there was learning along the way. There were those from the Commission who protected the citizens and tried to coach them. And the politicians had to kind of start to accept this logic. The heads of the working group started finding better ways of integrating the cultures. So we're not quite there yet, for sure, but something really, really interesting happened. So then the question is, 3 minutes left. Absolutely, thank you. So where do we go from there? There is much, much to draw from. Here we have the OECD Good Practice Guide that Andrea passed on to me. Thank you, Andrea. And you know, we have huge amounts of documentation, including Claudia Strelitz at the OECD did so much, you know, but many, many others, piles and piles, books, articles to tell us, how do you do better citizens assembly? Nevertheless, the transnational approach is still, you know, is still in debate. So there are two paths that we are all looking at right now. One is just keeping it as it has been now with COFE, a consultative process. The good thing there is you need no treaty change. So there's big questions of scalability, using just basically reproducing Irish or Ulster-Belgian Citizens Assembly. There are big questions about, you know, how we would do selections better, how we would, Vanchik and de Groot also proposed that the EU's anti-racism coordinator explore representativeness in this future assembly. Would it just be to give feedback on in the process, throughput, as Vivian Schmidt would say, on draft legislation, en passant? Will it be agenda setting at critical junctures in the EU, some big moments of deliberation on key pillars? This is something Philip has been playing with in his proposals. Agenda setting, but what does agenda setting really mean when the agenda can be kind of manipulated? And how do you institutionalize a consultative process that is truly independent, not structured necessarily by the powers that be? So that's some of the questions. My favorite is where. I would like to see a nomad citizen assembly that kind of rotate. Antoine Verne, who from Mission Publique speaks about big tent forums. You literally go with big trucks around Europe and set up tents and have members of the citizen assembly speak with local citizens. It's really cool. Others like Nicolo Milanese would say, like, no, let's please the French and your Strasbourg. Can we combine the two? Can we connect it with other conventions? What is the role of the digital platform? We'll come back to this. And the symbolics of all this. You know, my wonderful student, Faye Kirsch, you know, wants to use some Harry Potter methods to kind of convocation of the citizens so that it becomes a solemn thing that the village and town knows about. Philip has this wonderful idea of the citizens when they're first there, they dole out some cash. How better than to get the attention of the citizenry than they distribute stuff. We can come back to this. But let's and so we have different kind of academic takes on all this, but the alternative is much more revolutionary, would require treaty change. It's all about output binding alternatives. Can you really have a legally binding permanent citizens assembly? And by the way, the selection is also about how long will they do it for? A week, a month, 3 months, 6 months? There are many different ideas of how long should these citizens serve so that they don't become mini politicians, or they do become mini politicians. That's one question. But if it's binding, there here big questions that we can explore in the Q&A. But is it that it's binding that, you know, there is a, like in the Netherlands Parliament, you have EU institutions, head of states have an obligation to provide feedback, democracy as justification, or is it an obligation to implement? You know, that what does binding really mean, right? Do they have veto power on EU draft legislation? Do they have the right of initiative, dear to Karsten Berg, about, you know, leading to ECIs, veto powered ECIs, or not, ECIs that are pan-European, that are more like preferenda? And how can we integrate all these democratic tools? I know I'm over time, so I'm just going to go bullet pointy now. Big conversation we're having is that, is this permanent citizen assembly like that? Or, you know, colleagues and friends say, no, it shouldn't be one assembly. It should be many different ones that are connected. I say, no, make it the focal point, because citizens need a focal point, but embedded in a broader ecosystem. And so the ecosystem has to do with all these distributive initiative, ECIs, EB, etc. It has to do with my democratic panopticon that I presented here last year with Philip. It has to do with how it's connected to contestatory politics. And it has to do in the big picture, and I'm finishing here, Lorenzo, with what I call for always the third democratic transformation. And the idea that if we have a third democratic transformation after Athens, after parliaments, that this third democratic conversation, the transformation is happening anyway. Young people are doing it anyway. Look at our students, look at everything that's happening in the world. So the only question that is left for the EU is whether it's going to be in this picture, whether it's going to be in the time of global Anthropocene, in the picture of the third democratic conversation, and basically doing democracy with foresight, transnational, transtemporal, transscale, so that the EU becomes the place for democracy for the long term, powered by its citizens who really do care about the long term, contrary to the Tocquevillian idea that democracy is short-termist. So Citizens Assembly, yes. Permanent, yes. At the EU level, yes. Transnational, yes. But embedded in a bigger vision of what future of democracy should be all about. Thank you. And sorry, I went 5 minutes over time.
Thanks, Kalypso. Yeah, Veronica has slides. So, yeah.
So thanks so much for inviting me to finally be able to make Kalypso listen to what I understand the democracy is. We've had many conversations, but I think that we've always thought about the future and what comes next, and we've never really touched the basis, right? So I always consider myself a fan of this theory, but I'm not sure you ever knew why. So now I have the chance to tell you as part of this round of conversations for the future of Europe. And the reason why I always thought that this is such an inspiring approach is exactly because I believe that it captures Europe's absurdities. The metaphor that you use is that of the Rubicon between the supranational state and the national state. But that's exactly the absurd idea that this encapsulates. So if you go back to this philosophical nature of democracy that you've put together, I think it's just right because it codifies this absurdity of existence that going back to the individual is pretty much what keeps us, accepting the type of life that we live. But it's also goes away from the fact that people have a desperate attempt to give meaning to this absurd life without a meaning, which leads to this infernal impasse, right? If there is no expectation of a goal. So if you don't reach for the nation state, if you don't reach for a supranational state, if you don't reach for something, right? It even contradicts the idea of sailing on the Rubicon, because even the Rubicon has a direction. So that's one of the things that I like, but it's also an internal contradiction that I think we need to debate. Because if we wonder what is this state, right? What is the state that democracy proposes short of the modern nation state? We can go back, right? So how it used to be before the modern nation state and borrow a lot of things from that, which is something that we do actively when we consider this theory. But we can also look forward and just wonder, what does this theory want? So short of the modern nation state means short of borders, short of passports, which is modern invention. It also means short of nationalism, right? But does it also mean that it's short of citizenship, which is connected to nationalism, to borders, to passports in a way, and to Europe? So here is where, again, there's another contradiction with the idea of citizens' power. Now, what this means in practice is actually one of the last points that you made, that this is already happening. So individuals walk in and out and in again, multi-layered identities. So it's no longer just, it's not just nationalism, it's not just Europeanism. I often say when everyone asks the first question after saying hello, so where are you from? Come on, I mean, really small talk. I don't identify with a nation state. But sometimes I have to identify with a nation state when I don't have a choice. I have to show my passport, I have to travel and so on. And it's a useful thing to have, particularly when you're outside the European Union. So this is what it means, that we choose to enter things and we can't escape that. It also means that if you go beyond these things, you also have to go beyond the social values that make the modern state, which is the idea of home, the idea of roots, the idea of this, the nuclear family, or whatever kind of clan that we decide to build for ourselves. The idea of a certain identification with an approach to our economic lives. So the future would mean going beyond all these borders, the borders in our minds, the borders of gender, the borders of different social values. So in that way, how did you? Oh. My question then becomes, how will all this work, right? If democracy is built on the individual's everyday choice between one identity and another, some just wanting to maximize the utility of an identity. I wasn't a Romanian by choice, but I was a Romanian when I applied for grants that were specifically directed at Eastern European citizens, and I was happy to embrace that identity then. So it's an everyday choice, and it's built on individual responsibility. What this means when you scale it up is that this is a deliberation built on the contrast between the right and the duty. You have a right to gender, but you don't have a duty to choose a gender. You have a right to citizenship, but you don't have a duty to be a part of a citizenship. And you get my drift. And nevertheless, you have the right to be a European, but you don't have a duty to be European either. However, it doesn't seem like we have this choice in this theory, because once we decide on this pan-European public sphere, which goes back to this idea of the deliberative democracy in a transnational context that we discussed, from Habermas to Klaus's offer, the good citizens, the good active citizens, how do we build those? But how can this deliberation be institutionalized to form political will? And this is the question that we have been able to see in practice, tackled by the building of these practicalities that derive from the idea of citizens' power from the paper that we also had to give for today. So these practicalities are somehow brought together in three main ideas. The first one was the main one, right? The case for the European Citizens Assembly. This paper that we read is mostly a very cool super report on the COFE. Now I know you call it COFE, and it makes sense for the first time, because I was now, yeah, it's a good acronym. I had struggled with it before, but now since it's COFE, yeah, that works.
I prefer tea, but
well, and it mobilizes. It's this report that really mobilizes, right? You tell us there was a deliberative energy. You call it healthy. And you also tell us that in line with the identification of absurdities, okay, now the recommendation 42 can be magic, but on the other hand, that also shows this idea of, the existential absurdity of life. That was what the 42 was about, or this is how I read it. And the idea of the legally binding and compulsory law or regulation to hold citizens' assemblies, somehow it doesn't sound in the end that innovative. And now I'm going to start pushing on more, what we could do more than this, right? So this is the commentary part. And this sounds more to me like jury duty, which is fine. It's a good idea. People want to participate and they have to participate, but it goes back to choice, right? And I think that's a problem. Then you have this idea of the transnational inclusive public space, which can lead to greater, which demands, greater intelligibility, access to, and education about, about the union's democratic life, which is exactly the opposite of the invisible Europe that you want in other writings and ideas of yours. But in fact, it just means strategic communication, which is something that European Union hasn't really leaned into that much, because for some reason, someone decided that democracy is self-explanatory, or Europe is self-explanatory, and it wasn't. So we lack this strategic communication now, but we might want to have it in the future. And the other recommendations were criteria on anti-discrimination in the labor market, which, well, yes, the EU is trying to do that, it's failing, but it is moving towards a design and practice of participatory policies that are capable to mitigate these power disparities. So again, I'm not really that sure that's such a new discovery that came from the citizens, or that their imagination has gone very far. And then there's this third idea of the democratic panopticon for greater accountability, which is similar to the struggle for, the right to know and the right to know how to know. In other words, who regulates the regulators? The fear of being watched is present if we see what's going on in Europe. And of course, the first idea that comes to mind, is look at Hungary, look at Eastern Europe, look at all these attempts to control the information environment. But actually, part of the monitoring reports that we have from the EU is that Austria was doing the same thing under courts. The media has significant problems in Italy as well. So this fear exists, but it doesn't only exist for the elite. This fear trickles down to the unprivileged population, who in fact experiences the idea of shame and guilt that comes with this sort of fear of being watched, very different than the privileged elites do. So it's very unlikely that you will have popular buy-in for the idea of being watched as well. I come from Eastern Europe, and should use this disclaimer because of our nation's significant problems with being watched, and how they perceive that. So this is my point, I think. What is the way forward for this third way? I think that democracy is not an analytical category, it is an ideology. And I am so happy that it is something that you, through your work and the work of others, have brought back into the people's attentions. You've practically made liberal democracy cool again in academia. And the third way is absolutely the way forward, but the practical innovations are not really innovations. So if you want participation, pay up. And now I'm happy to hear there are more brilliant minds like Philip Schmitter, who also thought of, cash rewards. And it's not just cash. You can pay up in status. You can pay up in other things, right? It's just there has to be a payoff. You want inclusive public space? You got to invest in PR. This just doesn't sound good, but there's no strategic communication that the European Union has been doing, and they've been losing a lot. You want the right to know? Well, then you have the duty not to mind if they know too. So this goes back to this idea of, really pushing for an ideology that is built on going beyond ideas of social conservative and going back to the individual and the responsibility that individual has. So these were my points here. Thanks you so much for listening to me while having your lunch. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Veronica. And now, Christoph, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Lorenzo and Felix, for having me. Thank you very much, Kalypso, for this very nice papers and talk. Maybe I should start my discussion with a short disclaimer that was already partly mentioned, but that resides in the fact that I work myself on deliberative democracy. I'm largely convinced by many of its merits, and I'm thus probably not the biggest critic one would find as a discussant, but of course I know both about the promises and the limits of deliberative citizen assemblies, and it is based on those that I have a few questions, both related to the papers and based on the things that were said today in the presentation. Let me maybe start with your paper on democratic theory, which was very interesting, also very refreshing, especially maybe subjectively as a Belgian who is confronted with this debate every day, where we discuss whether our country is, in fact, one democracy, two democracies, is it or should it be a democracy? But a very nice paper. And at the end of it, you also mentioned briefly that deliberative democracy is in fact something that could lead us towards more embracing democracy. And one would wonder then a bit more, and you said already today a few words in your presentation about how we can achieve with deliberative democracy the ideal of democracy. But you will see that among the questions I have in a second, I would like to know a bit more about this. On your other paper about Citizen Power Europe, where quite interesting, you proposed this combination of a European Citizens Assembly, of a transnational public space, and of your democratic panopticon. I have to say that intuitively it makes a lot of sense to democratize Europe with these citizen assemblies to make it inherently more just, because it is based on the recent exchange of independent and diverse citizens that makes recommendations, because it is instrumentally probably more democratic when we see that there are actually better decisions coming out of such a citizens assembly because of the epistemic diversity on which it relies, and because it has the potential to be more democratic by bringing Europeans together beyond the usual elites that already meet. You did not provide a very concrete model of the European Citizen Assembly, but the questions that I have will part from the assumption that it will be something that is permanent, that is randomly selected with regular rotation, that is also directly connected to EU decision-making, be it only consultatively, and that provides EU institutions regularly with policy recommendations. And so the three main questions I have regarding to this are the following. The first relates to scale. One of the main issues of democratic malaise that you brought up yourself is that the people feel disconnected from politics. And mini publics obviously have the potential to reconnect citizens with policy making. However, they touch on the first hand very few people. And in a smaller polities, one will argue that if you have many of them, it will add up. And at the end of the day, you will have more and more citizens who go through this kind of assemblies. On the European level, however, the polity is much larger. And in addition, we don't have at this stage a really common unified European public sphere, if you want. And my first question would be if European Citizen Assembly can really tackle the democratic malaise if you consider that it only touches a few people out of the European demoi, or put differently, maybe in a more positive way, how can we actually design European Citizen Assembly that avoids creating just another European Parliament drawn by lot this time, that people would also feel disconnected with, how to avoid having another political black box, if you want, next to the European Parliament. My second question relates more than to considerations of power, because I have been following with great interest also your democracy forum at the STG, where very interestingly we saw all these different people that were involved in the conference coming in. And as you said earlier during your presentation, there have been MEPs saying that we are legitimate because we are elected, and at the end of the day we are also citizens and we should take the decisions. But there were also people from civil society saying, well, we are the citizens because we are representing those that are organized. We see this on an everyday basis. We are professional, if you want, citizen representatives. And in many citizen assemblies we see around the world, something that comes up very frequently is not only opposition from politicians, but also from civil society. And this is not something very specific here to the European level, but what is specific to the EU is that civil society is very institutionalized in the EU public, in the different existing EU institutions. And my question would be, how would you deal with this in the European Citizen Assembly? Is there a possibility to some extent to bring also the civil society in closer or larger? Is it a bad or is it a good idea? And finally, coming back to the idea of democracy, I was wondering how you would design the European Citizen Assembly to be democratic. Or put differently, do you think it is sufficient to bring all these people from different EU countries together and it will go by itself? Or are there specific design features that we could use to make it more democratic? On a detailed note, you said it yourself, but I think, yeah, there is a lot of already existing empirical research out there and actual experiences that have started to institutionalize this. And I think there is a lot on which you could draw if you were to make a sketch, if you want, for a European Citizen Assembly. Maybe just one also more detailed note on an element that you brought up both in the paper and here in the presentation by talking about these assemblies as also drawing on the idea of statistical representation. It is something that is sometimes quite a bit contested by academics, because I know that Jim Fishkin always talks about reconstructing what the people would think if the entire polis was to deliberate. Although many people and academics, and me including, are a bit more skeptical about this idea of statistical representation, because of the simple reason that the amount of people that you can actually make reasonably deliberate is much smaller and will never achieve statistical representativeness. However, this is not even a problem insofar as what we are looking there for is descriptive representativeness, and you talk about it. And this diversity, if it is shown, if it is acknowledged, and if it manages to bring in the people that usually do not participate, is enough of a representative legitimacy to complement these traditional institutions. And so I'm still a bit skeptical of this idea of statistical representation. That is my main point. And to close, I'd like to come briefly back on what Veronica said on her last slide by saying that, well, to bring people in, we need money. I agree with it, although current experiences of deliberative mini-publics that pay citizens show that also they still have problems to recruit people that usually would not come. Even there, if you give them money, there will still be issues of people that say either, well, I don't have the time, or I'm not convinced of the purpose. And there's recent, very interesting academic work showing that what also motivates people is if politicians show them that there is purpose and there is actually something that is done with what they do. And so I guess that in addition to having money, I guess one of the biggest merits to bring people in is to show that there is something that is done with what they do. And that would be my short complementary point to close with all this. And yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so just in order to provide sort of transition then to Kalypso's response, I think it would really be extremely useful if you could reply at least to the following two questions. One that has been raised by both commentators, which is the exact nature of the connection between democracy and then a citizens' deliberative assembly. In particular, one question I've often wondered is whether the demoi in European democracy is meant to refer to 27 demoi or to 27 plus 1 demoi. That is in a democratic perspective, is the idea that democracy is working at the level of each of the component member states, or is one of the demoi, which is supposed to work also the common demos? And then, of course, the question is, when you have transnational deliberative assemblies, isn't then the demos, among all these demoi, which you try to strengthen, the common demos? And comes then the question of the design. So you can say, well, what we are strengthening there is the demos, is not the 27, but the one that is common. And then, but when we try to strengthen the demos, we must take into account that this demos is fragmented in various ways and probably in more than 27 ways. And therefore the design needs to be special. It's different to have a deliberative assembly organized in Ireland or in Iceland or even in Italy than it is to organize it at a transnational level. And therefore the fine grain of the design matters. And then what is it also in the light of the experience that should be present? And then the second question is then related to well, also something that appeared in both interventions, which is really this question of statistical representativeness. And so is it achievable given the many hidden variables in the self-selection of the people? And is it important? Because after all, perhaps what matters is that these assemblies should come up with proposals that emerge from the people who, for whatever reasons, were particularly interested in political matters at that level, and therefore also particularly well informed or particularly willing to get the information at that level. And it's not that important to take into account the views of people who don't care or who will never bother to get the information that's required. So these are two questions, if you, and there are others that appear, if you could, we could start the discussion with a response to one, to exactly what matters if you adopt a democratic point of view in the design of what we need, and two, how important is it to be representative in a statistical sense, and to what extent can it be achieved?
And I know quickly, because we don't have much time left. So let me start with your two questions, see if I need to include, but thank you so much, Veronica, Christophe, lots of food for thought, indeed. And I love the absurdity. Yes, at the end of the day, that's what we all come back to. We try to give a bit of meaning by sitting around a table together. So Philip, that's kind of my, Enrique knows this very well, really thinking through very systematically the connection between democracy and political innovation in general, and Citizen Assembly in particular. But let me just say three things. One is that democracy is a kind of a conservative theory. It first starts by describing the EU as is. It pushes back against all these, reform, magic bullet, make the European Parliament all powerful, make the Commission government of EU, all these magic bullets. No, it says, no, more or less, we have a good balance in the EU with some tweaking needed. But it's a revolutionary idea. I'm not sure it rehabilitates liberal democracy, but it is compatible. It is, tries to, but in transformative way, because the biggest thing about democracy is horizontality. horizontality. It's not sovereigns next to each other. That is a misunderstanding, a sovereignist misunderstanding, maybe closer to my friend Bellamy's vision, but yes, there is an issue about self-determination of the peoples of Europe, of different places of democracy, of what I call circles of autonomy. Yes, sovereign self-determination. But the key to democracy is EU won't work in the long term and be sustainable if there isn't this horizontal entanglement between its people all the way down. The bureaucrats are entangled, the heads of states are entangled, everybody's entangled. High up, what about low down? That's the initial, intuition. And there you see right away that it makes sense to have citizens assembly. Yeah, and granted the specific design questions, but your 27 plus 1, I mean, yes, originally didn't make that clear. It looked like just 27 reified, when I wrote first 20 years ago about this. But of course, you could say there's a 28th, but what is this 28th? It is crucial. You could say, well, it's a European people in the making. Should we use the term people or not? I don't really care in some ways. It's up to the constellation of scholars who write on democracy. They might prefer to think of it as the European public sphere. That is the place where the horizontal entanglement needs to happen. That these people's and why I hesitate to call it the 28th as in any other member state, because the key to the democratic instinct is that you do not want an EU polity where a European majority decides straightforwardly, like in the US, even with tweaks, as we know, the US system. Because in these formal democratic theory terms, a democracy is where you accept to be the minority one day because you know that the majority will more or less respect your interest and that you can be the majority in the next day. At the European level, it won't work. That's why I'm against electing a European president, at majority of, and where does this come from? My obsession with small and medium-sized countries. I'm more Greek than French on that way. I am more, Belgian, Maltese, and Lithuanian than German. And yes, we have digressive proportionality in Europe, but not enough. And if anti-hegemony means anything, it means respecting the small ones, the vulnerable in society and the small countries. And I could go back to 18th century balance of power theory with my IR hat, but leave it there. Meaning that concretely, yes, very quickly. So that gives the compass. When Veronica, you were asking, well, what is the compass? On the Rubicon, you still need a horizon. You don't have the nation state, you don't have the Europe. First of all, you have both. You have elements of both. And that's what we have in the Citizens Assembly. You still have your anchor in the nation. You still have your vision of togetherness at the EU level. But what is the compass? What is the horizon? It is mutual recognition and it is non-domination. I stop at that, but it has very, very concrete implication for the design, because then what does it mean for the design of the Citizens Assembly? It means that the key is the entanglement. That's why I resist colleagues who say, no, let's have national Citizens Assembly, and then they send messages to each other. No, this has to be places where you discuss across border. Multilingualism is going to become easier and easier, and Philip, that's your area. But there's so much to think about on how you do it. There will be technology where you can kind of do it, in addition to English Esperanto, which is obvious. I think that this is the first imperative. Now, then there is your question about, well, who, and of course, civil society. Christoph's question, civil society groups are the connectors. They're the ones who, they self-select, but they have given their flesh and blood, their sweat and blood for all their lives, to be involved in connecting people across border, whatever they're protecting, whatever rights and duties, but depends. So yes, they should be overrepresented. And it's yet another conception of representation that should be part of the mix. And then when you ask Philip, what about those who don't care? That's the whole point about the panopticon. And that's the whole point Veronica was also making, is that if it's there, the space is there. You can occupy it or, watch Netflix all day or go to walk in the forest and not take part. That's our choice, our freedom. This is a story about freedom, but it needs to be there. And I just need to make one small point about panopticon. That has to be the ecosystem within which Citizen Assemblies. It's democracy everywhere. It's not about being watched, Veronica. That's wrong. This is about us watching, and this is totally asymmetric. The watching power, watching the possibility of arbitrary power, always checking on arbitrary power and refusing to be watched. So it's a very asymmetric idea, and an idea that, on the ecosystem, schools. It has to start doing democracy at school, not being taught with slides that there is the EU, this is what it works like. Doing. It's about people, citizens getting their boots dirty. And let me also finish by saying that I'd have much more answers to give more precisely. But what I would say is that, first of all, we are a whole team, and I hope many of you and many listening and others, we will be thinking about all these very concretely in the next months and years, and we'll all be working together. This is not going to come up out of anybody's head. It's crowdsourced, because that's the spirit of it, right? But very important is the narrative. It's the story, how it can fire up the imagination of citizens, even if they don't take part. That this is why, the thinking about doing mini interventions around connecting, it's happening everywhere. People deliberate, people decide in their cities, etc. But it's the awareness, seeing each other, as happened in COVID. That was amazing. You had 5 billion people doing things on their window in various ways, watching each other. And I think that this collective imagination of doing democracy together, even if you do it in different ways from different places, that's the story we need to kind of, tell. So I'll stop at that.
Thanks, Kalypso. I think we don't have much time left, but still we can open the floor for the discussion. I don't see any hands raised up on Zoom. So yeah, Philip, and if somebody else wants to join, just raise the hand. Okay, so Philip, then Claudia. And then on this side, maybe we group three comments, and then we go back to Kalypso. Philip.
Well, I hesitate to intervene because we don't have any time. It's all been taken. So we don't really have enough time to discuss this, especially if you are as utterly opposed to this idea as I am. So I don't know if we have sufficient time to go into the details. So maybe it'll have to be another meeting. But I would just like to, well, first I have to, a quick anecdote. Jim Fishkin came into my office one day at Stanford. I'd never met the guy, and told me he was going to hold a Citizens Assembly on Europe. I think it was held in Strasbourg. And he then later, I looked and read and listened to the discussion. It was the most ridiculous manipulation of citizens I have ever experienced. And the simple reason is that selecting people randomly, we know from survey research that people don't know very much about the EU. So if you select people randomly, you are essentially selecting people who are going to be programmed by those who organize the assembly. So the entire thing was cooked up by those who told the people chosen to do it. So it was a completely top-down, even though it disguised itself as bottom-up. And I don't see how you can avoid that, given the distribution of knowledge and who then supplies the information to those who are supposed to deliberate. So never mind. That's my first thing. Just these are very quick points. I like the idea of a third transformation of democracy. That's exactly what I'm working on. And I think it should be in exactly the opposite direction. So what we need is a new design for democracy, not a new design, a reinforced design for democracy, which already exists in lots of democracies. Almost all existing democracies are already democratic in the sense that they have people in them by social class or by religion or by language or whatever, in historical experience, whatever, who all wish they were in a different polity or would. So I don't know, I'm surprised that there's no mention whatsoever in your approach to the so-called consociational conceptions of democracy. Now, the basis of a consociational democracy approach is that democracy is not only about numbers, it's also about intensities, that preferences that people have. So you cannot reduce democracy to simply a matter of numbers, as you do in random sampling, or for that matter, if you could get large-scale turnouts. You have to pay attention to the fact that some people are much more directly disadvantaged by, interested in, whatever. So intensities are important. So in my conception of a democracy for Europe, looks very consociational. That is, it looks a little bit like, I don't know, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Austria at some point, it's still, I think. So the point here is that, and what you need is exactly the opposite of this. You need incentives to create a professional class of European politicians who regard Europe as a constituency. And it's exactly the opposite that you need to do. People will regard the EU as democratic in the same way that the Swiss think their system is democratic, or the Dutch, etc., because there are pillars or arrangements of civil society organizations, as well as political parties, movements, etc., which are rooted in people. And then you have negotiations between the leaders of these organizations, and that's what makes it democracy. So the shedding aside of civil society seems to me to be a serious defect. It certainly is when you think of it consociationally. So I encourage all of you to think about consociationalism and that literature. And that is a much more viable and, I think, democratic outcome for Europe. Sorry.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, and Claudia. And also, since maybe at 2 p.m. we'll close the online session, also because I don't see much interaction. But for those in the room, we can stay maybe for a few minutes more, so we can have a more, discussion. And also, yeah, Claudia.
Yeah, I would like to support that point. We also started 10 minutes late, so we can give it some additional time. Thanks a lot. And I'm also not getting into this very big discussion at this point, but I have some, I think, straightforward comments to what you presented, Kalypso, on your case in favor of citizen assemblies. Because I think in that paper, I read your paper, you make a strong case for what are the benefits of citizens assemblies. And I would like to say that I find many arguments very convincing. So the open questions that remain to me is, how do we get into a situation where people actually listen to each other? And I don't mean the citizens in the citizen assemblies, but how do we get policymakers to listen to the citizens and vice versa? Because this is not yet built in those citizen assemblies. That maybe refers to this question of how binding is the output or not. But to me, in my experience, this is always a major practical problem in all of those deliberative processes. I have studied them in German, at the German local level, that you have the citizens assemblies and they deliberate and then nobody listens to what they say. Which probably links to what Philip just said. And then a second question, I'm not sure to what extent citizens indeed choose between different identities. Even though I buy into this point, I think you were making the point that these citizen assemblies could strengthen a kind of European identity because people will sort of be occupied and be discussing the EU level. So I think this is sort of what I gathered you were referring to. And I think that seems convincing, but isn't it so that not so many people differentiate so strongly, and that Europe is not for them the same, or rather the same, than the national political level. So isn't Europe where Macron and Scholz meet anyway? And Macron is at the national level and Macron is also at the European level, question mark. So I'm not sure to what extent it really is a choice, or to what extent it's not more about referring to a kind of upper level, which can be the national level or which can be the European level. I'm not sure if you get that point. And the third point, I think, if this should be institutionalized, the citizen assemblies, then there is indeed a quite decisive legitimacy issue, maybe not a problem, but a legitimacy issue, because the MEPs or the MPs, they are indeed elected by procedures that have their deficiencies. We all know that. But many people have spent many ideas on legitimizing these procedures. And how can this legitimacy clash be resolved? Because I think what the citizen assemblies would do is to put another logic of legitimization by thought or by whatever, besides that logic of the vote. These are my three questions. Thanks.
Thanks. I think we have one intervention here on the side of the table, and then Ulrike. Maybe we group these four and then back to Kalypso.
Yes. Thanks so much, Kalypso, for elaborating this idea of a citizens assembly. And I have a question in this relation, like
Can
more
you quickly can you introduce yourself?
yes. Matteo Bottero from the University of Copenhagen, and here also the Robert Schuman Center. Matteo Bottero. Yes, we've met already in Copenhagen sometimes. Yes. And yeah, my question relates to practical to the functioning of this citizens assembly. So it's like, what did the last citizens assembly bring to the EU, in your opinion, and what a permanent assembly would bring, though, and with what powers? And more generally, I have also like another question that is, why would it be better for us to be represented by a random person instead of an elected representative? And thanks.
Thanks, Matteo. Ulrike?
Yeah, I'd like to make a few comments, starting with yours, Claudia, saying that's the problem of legitimacy, introducing permanent citizens, European citizens assemblies. So if you look in the Lisbon Treaty, the chapter on democracy, the democratic life in the European Union, this is made up and defined as representative and participatory, strengthening, the democratic life. This is has been a novelty of the Lisbon Treaty and the Constitutional Treaty before. So we have a legal basis to bring in and also systematize and institutionalize the participatory component. And the second question is, and you are right, and we all have seen that, the Conference on the Future of Europe with the 4 citizens panels has been really compromised from the beginning on, because heads of states and governments were very disunited about what to make with the outcome, impact. And we are all sure that making the impact and defining from the beginning on of this exercise what the impact will be, what will be the procedure to implement, how binding, to what extent, bring in another referendum like in France after the French climate convention. Yeah, there were surveys, and there was so this didn't happen. This was a big problem, but in the future to make citizens cynical or resigned citizens, to motivate them, I think this is a crucial question, knowing that this will be effective. If they participate, it will have an effect, yeah. And on the other hand, make politicians, professional politicians, listen, and they don't do that normally. I'm participating for several years in electoral and party politics in Germany, in the EU. Politicians normally are not used to listening, they are talking. So, and this was new. The Conference on the Future of Europe is innovative in 3 senses. It's participatory, bringing citizens' participation center stage. Second, it's transnational. Yeah, it's a transnational, and it was defined as bringing in also and motivating, mobilizing national and regional citizens assemblies and integrate them into the process of the transnational assembly. This would be a multi-level European Citizens Assembly, which didn't work so far. It was attempted, but only some of the member states started doing that and others didn't. So the digital platform should have helped. This was linked to this multi-layered exercise. The digital platform is really a technological innovation that needs to be built on and improved. And the third real novelty is that citizens sat together with the professional politicians in the plenaries and in the working groups. 7th plenary will be at the end of this week. And many politicians, they just got up and left when citizens started to speak up. And they spoke out and complained and said, so it's impossible and this is not just and not working. And they changed they got much more attention, and citizens got very, very vital in claiming rights, which from the beginning on were not written anywhere. So they got a lot more of responsiveness than any of us observers and civil society activists would have expected. We were much more critical. Yeah.
Thanks, Ulrike. Kalypso.
Claudia is right. We did start 10 minutes late, so perhaps we could go a bit over. And I apologize, Philip, that yeah, sure, we would need much more discussion, because to start with Philip, I mean, a lot of time has gone since Fishkin came in your office. And, you know, thousands and tens of thousands of people have been, hundreds of thousands of people have been involved in citizens' assemblies, you know, from, you know, Brazil to Brussels. And so much.
I know a lot about the Brazilian ones. They're usually local ones. They only hold 2 national ones.
We can't hear you.
Yeah, I mean, okay, Philip is saying, well, they're usually local. Indeed, that is, so there's huge amounts of experience. There is a lot of thinking, and Christoph could tell us much more about exactly how to guard against this manipulation, but it's always there. What is the flaw of democracy anyway? Since when, you know, Weber said it very well, the iron cage is that bureaucracies do things well, the guardians who know, but they don't always do things well. And we live in the 21st century where there is such a thing as collective intelligence, so much out there. How do we mobilize it for our democracy? That should be a challenge that you would embrace and is amazing and wonderful. So I think there is a lot, no, but Philip, please be open to, you know, things change, things evolve. And here we are learning. It's an experiment. That's if there's one word to put in this story, it's experiment. And Ulrike just said it again. So how do we bring citizens in of all types? Now you talk about consociational. One reason I don't use it very much, I can't pronounce it. That's, you know, my problem. But I've written a lot about it and the relationship with democracy. It's not the same thing. Consociational is still a representative model, an indirect representative model where groups are overrepresented at the center in various ways. But the difference is that we live in a Europe where preferences, it's an overlapping consensus of overlapping consensus, to be Rawlsian here. That is that the overlapping consensus have been worked out at different levels, sometimes city, often national, back to Philip's question. So we have already spaces, democratic spaces that work more or less well. We just had the French election. They're very, very strong. That's not the same as a consociational model. And so the question is, how do you connect those spaces? And how do you connect those spaces it has to be all over national democracy, not a professional class of there. We completely disagree. In fact, it should be the life and blood of national democracies. It's called Europeanization in EU studies, but the life and blood of European democracies to be imbued with European issues that are connected to national issues. It happened a bit in the French election. It should happen more and more. Not a separate space out there. Europe is part and parcel of what happens in every village of France. That's the fact of it. And it should be debated as such. So it's not the same. You know, okay, so, but we could have a longer conversation. So Claudia, but very related in a way to Walter. I mean, yes, it's all about listening to each other, and Ulrike gave a, you know, echoed also some of what I said when we witnessed what was going on and how it was a learning process, and they were each had to learn, you know, the citizens also had to learn to, how do they work, these politicians, and vice versa. And wow, to witness that. And there, I think that's important to witness. One of the sad things about COFE is that it hasn't been witnessed. It's not always about taking part, you know, back to your second question. It's about witnessing, you know, just like you watch some, you know, the parliamentary channel. No, I never watched it in continental Europe, but in the UK, everybody watches Westminster Question Time on Wednesdays because it's kind of fun and it's interesting and people swear at each other, which is kind of okay, you know, as long as they do so politely. Right honorable gentleman, right honorable citizen, you know, you you don't mean anything, you know. I mean, so is this going to be watchable? That's a very interesting question. And when would people watch? It's because, and that goes to Walter's question, you know, and Claudia. Yes, I mean, I and others who advocate Citizens Assembly, we're not saying it should override the vote. Nobody's saying this. The vote of representative democracy in the traditional way, MPs. I don't understand why every time we have this conversation, it's as if it was an alternative. Not at all. The point is how to combine them with Citizens Assembly more than a footnote, more than a faire valoir, more than what Philip very rightly describes, you know, just a little thing you manipulate on the side. And that's no, you know, but it should be combined. And in fact, it should itself include vote. I mean, vote at the end of the day at scale is necessary. Vote for reps, vote for proposals, vote for referenda that are well done, as in Switzerland, with informed, schooled citizens, etc. But the vote, yes, the vote is a great conquest. So it won't, Walter, it won't ever replace your vote. But I think what we all know, what is this crisis of democracy today, is that people want more than the vote. And at least more than the vote for MPs or presidents, etc. And it was said 100 times now in the French context. People want more than the vote. And so, and these assemblies mean that you could imagine being part of the deciders. I think we need to find ways of recover the ancient intuition that from time to time, hey, you could be a decider. Wow. Or my neighbor could be a decider, or someone I identify with, because you ask, you know, what's good about it? It's not just descriptive representation, it's identification. You saw the people could see these citizens, they're dressed differently, they speak differently, they fumble, they're funny. You can identify. So it has a lot of you know, advantages that don't need to replace representative democracy. And so, you know, and so Claudia, coming, you know, back to what you were saying. So this is not, besides, it's a different logic that is there to enrich the logic of the vote, you know, not to replace it. And that citizens, and I think I addressed the question of identity too. So I think that's about it. I'll stop here.
I won't enter further to the discussion, so we can keep talking after the end of the recording. I just want to say that our next session, so in 2 weeks' time, will be on a very different topic. Namely, it will be again a beyond, but not beyond the conference on the future of Europe, but it will be on beyond the European Green Deal. There again, we had something unprecedented, and it will be introduced by José Beke, who used to be the Director General for Climate in the European Commission. He's now a colleague of Kalypso's at the School of Transnational Governments, and obviously also in what he proposed to talk about, he'll have to talk about the completely unexpected new challenges for climate policy in Europe that come new challenges, but perhaps also new opportunities, but difficult opportunities that come from the conflict with Ukraine, including the latest decision now to block the gas provision to Bulgaria and Poland, waiting for other countries to follow, no doubt. So he'll touch also on these very concrete, immediate things, but it will be again also a reflection about what we need doing even beyond the Green Deal in order to address what is probably the biggest of all of our challenges at the moment at the level of mankind as a whole, which is climate change. And so, but thank you very much for the lively discussion. Thank you to Kalypso. Thank you to the two commentators, and we can continue informally without fighting. Okay, thank you very much.